The town of Coldwater sat nestled in a valley so deep it seemed the sun barely touched it. The surrounding woods, dense and endless, had been there long before the town. Locals called it Whispering Woods, a name passed down like a ghost story. The whispers started the same way every time, soft, like the sound of wind sliding through leaves, barely noticeable unless you were listening, but those who heard them couldn't unhear them. It was a voice, not one voice, but many, all speaking at once, and they never said the same thing twice. Emma Grayson had lived in Coldwater her whole life. At 17, she knew every crack in Main Street's pavement, every creak of the floorboards in Grayson's Grocers, her family's store. She knew that Miss Calloway at the post office always slipped rum into her coffee, and that Mr. Deacon had a stash of magazines under the counter of the hardware store that would make a noon faint. What Emma didn't know what no one knew was why people kept vanishing in the woods. It started small, as these things always do. A dog that chased a rabbit too far. A hunter who didn't come back before dark. But last summer, Danny Hart disappeared. Danny was Emma's best friend. They'd been inseparable since grade school. Danny was the kind of kid who'd set off firecrackers in an empty field just to see if someone would yell. He had freckles splattered across his nose and a grin that said he was always planning something. The night he vanished, he and Emma had been sitting on the hood of his beat-up truck, parked just outside the woods. The whispers started then. Emma thought it was the wind, but Danny froze, his grin dropping. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Emma listened. The air was still, but there it was, a faint murmuring, like voices tangled in a breeze. Danny slid off the hood, his sneakers crunching gravel. "Danny, don't," Emma warned. He didn't listen. He stepped into the tree line, his face pale, his mouth moving like he was repeating something under his breath. Then he was gone. The woods swallowed him, just like that. Emma screamed for him until her throat was raw. When she told the police, they shook their heads, said he'd probably run away. Kids did that all the time, they said, but Emma knew better. By fall, whispers of a different kind spread through Coldwater. Rumors. Mrs. Hart refused to talk to anyone, shuttering herself inside her house. Sheriff Tate started drinking heavier than usual. Some folks whispered about old stories their grandparents had told them, about the woods being cursed, about how you should never, ever follow the voices. Emma couldn't stop thinking about Danny, the way his eyes had looked, glassy and unfocused, as he walked into the trees. She'd started dreaming about him to dreams where he stood at the edge of the woods, his mouth moving, but no sound coming out. Then she heard it again, the whispers. It was a week before Halloween, and Emma had made up her mind. She would find Danny, or at least figure out what had happened to him. She packed a flashlight, a bottle of water, and her dad's old hunting knife. The first step into the woods felt like stepping into another world. The trees loomed taller than they seemed from the outside, their branches weaving together to block out the moonlight. The whispers grew louder, clearer. They weren't random anymore. They were calling her name. "Emma," they sighed, the voices overlapping. "Emma, come closer." She clutched the knife tighter, her heart hammering. "Danny," she called. The whispers stopped. The silence was worse. She kept walking, deeper into the woods. She found signs of others who had come before her, a torn scarf, a rusted pocket knife, a single muddy shoe. Then she saw it, a clearing bathed in pale light, and at its center, a massive oak tree with roots as thick as her arm. The whispers came back, loud now, filling her head like a swarm of bees. The tree seemed alive, its bark writhing like flesh. And then she saw them, faces, dozens of them, pressed into the bark. Their eyes stared, their mouths twisted as if they were screaming. Danny's face was there too. "Help me," he whispered, his voice weak, his lips barely moving. Emma dropped to her knees, the knife trembling in her hand. "What do I do?" she cried. The voices answered as one, "Stay with us." The ground beneath her shifted, soft as quicksand, roots coiled around her ankles. The knife clattered to the ground, just out of reach. She grabbed for it, but the roots tightened. She could feel them, cold and alive, pulling her closer to the tree. "Danny," she screamed. His face disappeared into the bark, and the whispers faded. Coldwater's secrets didn't stay buried. The woods always took what it wanted, and Emma. She was just another face in the tree. If you ever find yourself near Coldwater, remember this: the woods may whisper your name. Do yourself a favor, don't listen. The old Grandview Hotel had stood at the edge of town for nearly a century. It had seen better days, its once elegant facade now faded, with ivy creeping up the walls and broken shutters banging in the wind. Most folks in Ashford stayed away, save for the occasional tourist looking for cheap lodging or someone too desperate to care about the rumors. The stories always centered around room 217. The receptionist was an older woman with a sharp, bird-like face who seemed perpetually irritated. When Tess asked about room 217, she didn't even blink. "There is no room 217, she said flatly, sliding the key for room 216 across the counter. Her tone made it clear the conversation was over. Tess smirked, but didn't push. She took the key and headed upstairs, her boots clunking against the worn wooden steps. The hallway was dimly lit, the sconces casting just enough light to make the shadows in the corners seem alive. Tess counted the doors as she passed. Room 212, room 214, room 216. Her room was just as underwhelming as she expected: peeling wallpaper, a lumpy bed, and the faint smell of damp wood. She tossed her bag on the bed and pulled out her notebook. Outside, the rain started up again, tapping against the window like bony fingers. It was perfect writing weather, but the sound wasn't helping her concentrate. The tapping grew louder, sharper. Tess frowned and looked toward the door. That's when she noticed it. Faint whispers just beyond the walls. She froze, holding her breath. It was probably nothing. Old pipes, maybe, or the wind slipping through the cracks. But the longer she listened, the clearer it became. The whispers weren't random. They were soft and rhythmic, like a child singing a lullaby just out of tune. She stepped out into the hallway, her flashlight in hand. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, the light flickering overhead. And then she saw it, a door where there hadn't been one before. Room 217. Her breath hitched. The door was old, the wood warped and darkened with age, the brass knob tarnished. A faint glow seeped from underneath. Pale and sickly, Tess hesitated, her pulse quickening. She knew better than to investigate. It was every horror story cliché in the book. But the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, clearer. "Help me," they begged. "Please." Her feet moved before her brain caught up. She reached for the knob, her hand trembling, and turned it. The door opened silently, revealing a room that didn't belong. Inside was a lavish suite, untouched by time. The furniture gleamed like it was polished yesterday, and a crystal chandelier cast shimmering light across the floor. A single rocking chair sat by the window, moving back and forth even though the air was still. On the bed lay a doll with cracked porcelain skin, its painted eyes staring straight at her. The whispers stopped. Tess stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room. The door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, yanking at the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. And then she heard it, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone stepping toward her. She fumbled for her phone, the screen's glow barely piercing the gloom. In the mirror above the dresser, she saw them faces. Dozens of them, pressed against the glass, their mouths open in silent screams. They moved closer, their hands pounding against the surface, the mirror rippling like water. "Tess," a voice whispered behind her. She turned slowly, her breath catching. The doll was standing now, its cracked lips moving. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it said, its voice low and distorted. The chandelier shattered above her, raining shards of glass. The faces in the mirror surged forward, their ghostly hands reaching for her. She screamed, but it was swallowed by the shadows. No one saw Tess Malone leave the Grandview Hotel. Her car sat untouched in the parking lot for weeks before someone finally towed it. Room 217 was gone, of course, just like it always was. The locals whispered about the journalist who came to town and never left, but no one dared investigate. If you ever stay at the Grandview and see a door where there shouldn't be one, do yourself a favor. Walk away. Some doors are better left closed. The midnight bus to Brightwater wasn't much to look at. A rickety old thing, its faded blue paint peeling at the edges, headlights dimmer than they should have been. But it had its job, ferrying night shift workers and desperate travelers between the small, forgotten towns along Route 17. Eliza was one of those desperate travelers. The 23-year-old had packed up what little she owned: 2 bags, a worn journal, and a stack of overdue bills, and boarded the bus with no plan except to get far away from her past. She took a seat near the back, where the shadows swallowed everything after sunset. The driver, a pale, silent man with sunken cheeks, didn't glance at her as she climbed aboard. His uniform was neat, but his eyes were unsettling, milky like old glass. Eliza shivered but told herself it was just the cold. The bus rumbled to life and pulled onto the empty highway. The other passengers, a mix of sleepy faces and slouched figures, barely acknowledged her presence. Eliza stared out the window, the streetlights passing like slow, rhythmic heartbeats. She didn't notice at first, but after a while, the view outside stopped changing. The same stretch of dark trees, the same lonely gas station, the same mile marker. She glanced at the driver's reflection in the rearview mirror. His expression hadn't changed, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "Is there a problem?" He didn't answer. Eliza looked at the other passengers, but they all stared straight ahead, their faces blank. One by one, she noticed something strange about them. The man in the suit to rose up had dirt under his fingernails and a strange, hollow look in his eyes. The elderly woman across from him clutched a handbag with trembling hands, but her skin was pale, almost translucent. A teenage girl in a hoodie sat near the front, her face hidden, but Eliza swore she heard faint sobbing. The air in the bus felt colder. She checked her phone, no signal. "Where are we?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Hey," I asked a question. The driver turned to look at her. His neck creaked unnaturally, his eyes wide and unblinking. "You're here," he said, his voice low and rasping. The bus lurched to a stop. Outside, there was nothing but mist, thick and swirling like it had a mind of its own. The other passengers stood in unison, their movements stiff and mechanical. They filed off the bus silently, disappearing into the fog. "Wait," Eliza shouted. "Where are you going?" No one answered. She stayed in her seat, clutching her bag, her heart pounding. The driver turned to her again. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." "I'm not going out there," she cried. "Take me back." The driver's expression didn't change. "There's no going back." Before she could argue, the mist crept into the bus, curling around her ankles. It was ice cold, pulling at her like unseen hands. She screamed, grabbing for the seat, but the fog was relentless. It dragged her into the darkness, her cries swallowed by the void. When she opened her eyes, she was standing at a desolate bus stop. The bus was gone, the road stretching endlessly in both directions. Around her were the other passengers, their faces blank, their eyes unseeing. Eliza tried to speak, but no words came out. She looked down at her hands and saw that her skin was pale, translucent, just like theirs. In the distance, the sound of a bus engine rumbled closer. Another midnight bus was coming, and Eliza realized with a sinking dread that she would be on it forever. If you ever find yourself waiting for the midnight bus on Route 17, don't get on. No matter how desperate you are, no matter where you think you need to go, wait for the next one. Some roads don't lead back. Elmwood Bridge was older than anyone in Hollow Creek could remember. Its stone arches stretched over the sluggish river like the spine of a great beast, and its underside was a favorite spot for teenagers looking for trouble. But even the bravest of them avoided it after sunset. People whispered about the shadows under Elmwood Bridge. Not the ordinary kind cast by the moon or the street lights, but darker ones. They moved when nothing else did. They whispered, soft and insistent, though no one ever stayed long enough to hear what they said. Nobody in town liked to talk about what had happened to Jesse Rowe, though everyone remembered. He'd gone missing 2 summers ago, last seen hanging around the bridge after dark. The search party found his bike at the edge of the water, but no sign of Jesse. His disappearance was just one of many, dating back decades, that didn't stop 17-year-old Clara from going there one humid July evening. She wasn't afraid of stories, even the kind her grandmother used to tell about the bridge swallowing people whole. Clara had a knack for poking at things other people left alone, and tonight, she was looking for answers. The sun was just dipping below the horizon when she reached Elmwood Bridge. The water below was black and still, reflecting the last orange streaks of the sky. Clara stood at the edge, her flashlight cutting through the thickening dusk. "Jessie," she called. Her voice echoed strangely, as if the bridge itself was mocking her. "Anyone?" The shadows under the bridge shifted. At first, Clara thought it was a trick of the light. But as she watched, the dark shapes rippled and flowed, forming long, thin tendrils that reached out toward her. Her flashlight flickered, the beam dimming before going out completely. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling now. She took a step back, but the ground felt wrong beneath her feet, soft, like it was pulling her down. The whispers started then, faint, overlapping voices, rising and falling like the tide. They were speaking words she couldn't understand, but their tone was unmistakable. Hungry. Clara stumbled, falling onto her hands and knees. The shadows surged toward her, curling around her legs like living smoke. She screamed, scrambling to her feet, but they were too strong. The air was freezing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Please," she whimpered, clawing at the stone. "Let me go." The shadows paused, just for a moment, as if considering her plea. Then they dragged her down, into the cold, unyielding darkness beneath the bridge. By morning, Clara was gone, her footprints the only sign she'd ever been there. Another name added to the long list of those the bridge had claimed. They say if you stand on Elmwood Bridge at night and listen carefully, you can hear the whispers. Sometimes, they call your name. If you're smart, you'll leave before they find you. But if you're not, well, the shadows are always hungry. The clock arrived at Evelyn's doorstep in an unmarked box. It was old, with a brass frame tarnished green at the edges and a glass face so clear it seemed to swallow the light. Inside, the hands ticked, but they didn't follow the usual rhythm of time. They moved backward, counting down from a number Evelyn didn't recognize. 72 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. Evelyn didn't remember ordering it. She didn't even like clocks. But curiosity got the better of her, and she brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter. She tapped the glass, shook it gently, but the hands continued their backward march, ticking steadily toward an unknown 0. The next morning, strange things began happening. The coffee she poured into her cup vanished before it reached her lips. Her cat, Milo, stared at the clock, his fur bristling, and bolted out the door, refusing to come back inside. And Evelyn herself felt off. The world seemed dimmer somehow. The colors washed out, the edges of everything slightly blurred. When the clock reached 48 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds, she noticed the sounds. Faint at first, like whispers just out of reach. They grew louder as the day wore on, voices overlapping, frantic and pleading. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound came from inside her head. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" The whispers paused, as if listening. Then they answered, soft and cold, "Time." By 24 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds, Evelyn could barely sleep. The voices grew louder, their demands relentless. She tried throwing the clock away, driving it out to the edge of town and leaving it in a ditch. But when she returned home, it was waiting for her on the kitchen counter, the hands still ticking backward. Desperate, she covered it with a blanket, locked it in a closet, but the ticking drilled into her skull. Every second it counted down felt like a piece of her was being pulled away. Memories, warmth, life itself. She stared at herself in the mirror that night and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin pale and stretched, her eyes sunken and dull. The clock reached 1 hour 0 minutes and 0 seconds. Evelyn sat in the dark, the clock in front of her, the ticking impossibly loud. She couldn't stop staring at it, her body too weak to move. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices chanting in unison, "Time is up." When the clock struck 0 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds, the glass face cracked, and the voices stopped. For a brief, blissful moment, there was silence. Then Evelyn screamed. 2 days later, Evelyn's neighbors called the police, concerned about the smell coming from her house. They found her in the kitchen, slumped over the counter, her body withered as if decades had passed overnight. The clock was gone, leaving only a faint outline of its brass frame on the countertop. No one knew where the clock had come from, but a week later, another unmarked box appeared on a different doorstep, the hands sticking backward from 72 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds. If you ever receive a clock that counts backward, don't bring it inside. Don't open the box. Some things are best left untouched, especially time. Greystone wasn't on any map. Tucked away in a valley surrounded by dense, snow-covered woods, the town seemed to exist only for those who already knew it was there. Its population was small, and its winters were brutal, but the residents didn't complain. They knew better than to draw attention to themselves. Every winter, like clockwork, the town vanished. Visitors rarely came to Greystone. It wasn't a place you stumbled across, and the locals liked it that way. But on December 14th, an outsider arrived. His name was Peter Hayes, a traveling journalist with a fascination for unexplained phenomena. He'd heard rumors about Greystone, a town that vanished every winter and reappeared in the spring. Its people alive but unwilling to explain what had happened. Peter thought it was a hoax, but he wanted a story, and Greystone seemed like the perfect one. The townsfolk were polite when he arrived, but cold. They didn't answer his questions, and when he mentioned staying through the winter solstice, the mood shifted. The mayor, a wiry man with tired eyes, took Peter aside and spoke in a low, urgent voice. "You don't want to be here after the first snow," he said. "Leave before it falls. That's all the warning I'll give you." Peter ignored him. Warnings like that were exactly what he was looking for. He rented a room at the town's tiny inn and waited. The snow began falling on the evening of December 20th. By midnight, the town was blanketed in white. Peter woke to the sound of howling wind and looked out his window. The streets were empty, the houses dark, but something about the scene felt wrong. The snow didn't just fall, it seemed to swirl, circling the town in patterns too precise to be natural. By morning, the streets were silent. Peter stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow. The town was eerily still. No smoke rose from chimneys. No lights shone in windows. He knocked on doors, but no one answered. It was as if everyone had simply vanished. That night, the noises began. At first, it was faint, a low humming sound, like distant machinery. Then came the whispers. Peter pressed his ear to the window, trying to make out the words, but they were jumbled, overlapping, and strange. They weren't coming from the empty houses, they were coming from the woods. He tried to leave, packing his car and driving toward the road that led out of town, but the snow had buried everything. The tires spun uselessly, and the road ahead dissolved into the blinding white. When he got out to check, the path he'd come from was gone, replaced by an unbroken expanse of snow. The next morning, he noticed the marks. Footprints circled his car, deep and deliberate, but they weren't human. The impressions were large, with long, claw-like indentations. They led toward the woods and disappeared into the shadows. By the 23rd, Peter was out of options. The food in his room was running low, and the temperature seemed to drop by the hour. He thought about breaking into one of the houses, but found he couldn't bring himself to do it. The windows and doors looked wrong somehow, like they were watching him. That night, he decided to follow the footprints. He set out with a flashlight and a thick coat, his breath fogging in the icy air. The footprints led him deep into the forest, where the trees were packed so tightly together that the wind barely reached him. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the branches, until he stepped into a clearing. At the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, each taller than a man and carved with symbols Peter didn't recognize. The snow inside the circle was untouched, glowing faintly under the moonlight. Peter stepped closer, his heart hammering. Then he saw them. The townsfolk stood around the circle, their faces pale, their eyes empty. They moved in unison, their lips forming silent words. As Peter watched, the glow from the stones grew brighter, the air thick with static. He tried to call out, but no sound left his throat. The light enveloped the clearing, blinding him. When he opened his eyes, the circle was empty. The townsfolk were gone. The stones stood silent, their glow extinguished. Peter stumbled back to the inn, his mind racing. The whispers had stopped, but he knew he couldn't stay another night. When he opened his room's door, he froze. The mayor was sitting on his bed. "You should have left," the mayor said, his voice hollow. "It's too late now." Peter tried to run, but the door slammed shut. The last thing he saw was the mayor's face, his mouth twisting into a grin that wasn't human. By spring, Greystone reappeared. The townsfolk went about their business, smiling politely at each other as if nothing had happened. But in the woods, just beyond the clearing, a journalist's notebook lay buried in the snow, its pages frozen solid. If you hear about a town that disappears every winter, don't go looking for it. Some places don't want to be found. Here's the story for the phone call from the other side. It started with a simple ring. Megan Parker was alone in her apartment, curled up on the couch with a cup of tea and a true crime documentary playing softly in the background. The phone on the end table rang. Shattering the quiet, she frowned. She didn't recognize the number, but something about it made her stomach twist. Block numbers weren't unusual, but the area code 000 wasn't real. She hesitated, then picked up. "Hello," she said cautiously. For a moment, there was only static. Then came a voice, faint and distorted, like someone speaking underwater. "Megan," she froze. "Who is this?" The static deepened, the voice growing clearer. "Help me," it said. It was familiar to familiar. Megan's hand tightened on the receiver as her pulse quickened. "Dad," she whispered. Her father had been dead for 3 years. The call ended abruptly, leaving Megan shaking. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. It had to be a prank. Someone had to know about her father's death, and they'd thought it was funny to mess with her. She told herself that over and over, but the voice, it had been his. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming, always from the same impossible number, always the same static-laced voice. Her father, he repeated the same phrase, over and over. "Help me." Megan tried to ignore it, unplugging her phone, switching it off, but it didn't matter. The calls found her. They rang from her cell phone, her work line, even the old landline in her apartment building's lobby. It was as if the voice was following her, growing more desperate with each call. By the 5th day, Megan couldn't take it anymore. She answered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "What do you want?" she screamed into the phone. The static crackled, and for the first time, the voice changed. It was quieter, more urgent. "It's not me," it said. "It's not me." "What does that mean?" Megan demanded. But the line went dead. That night, Megan dreamed of her father. He stood at the end of a long, dark hallway, his face shadowed but unmistakable. "Don't answer," he said, his voice low and fearful. "Promise me, Megan, don't pick up." When she woke, her phone was ringing again. The screen flashed the same number, Oh oh oh. She let it ring this time, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the phone was vibrating in her skull. Finally, she snatched it up and pressed it to her ear. Stop it, she shouted. The static was deafening now, almost drowning out the voice. It's coming, it said. It knows. What knows? Megan cried, but the line went silent. The phone in her hand turned ice cold, and she dropped it with a gasp. The next day, strange things began happening. Shadows in her apartment moved when nothing else did. Objects shifted places when she wasn't looking. And at night, when she tried to sleep, she swore she could hear faint whispers, like a chorus of voices, just outside her bedroom door. By the time the phone rang again, Megan was too terrified to ignore it. She answered on the first ring. What do you want? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's here, the voice said. Her apartment lights flickered, and the air grew icy. The shadows in the corner of the room deepened, pulling together until they formed a shape tall, angular, and wrong. It moved toward her, its limbs bending unnaturally, its face a void of nothingness. Megan screamed, backing into the wall as her father's voice filled the room one last time. I'm sorry, Megan, he said. I couldn't stop it. The thing lunged, and the world went black. The next morning, Megan's neighbor found her apartment empty. The furniture was still there, her belongings untouched, but Megan herself was gone. The only thing left was her phone, lying on the floor with its screen cracked. It rang once before the neighbor picked it up. A voice on the other end whispered faintly, "Help me." If you ever get a call from a number you don't recognize, think twice before answering. Some voices don't belong to the living. The first time Mia saw them, she thought it was her imagination. She was brushing her teeth before bed. The bathroom mirror fogged from the steam of a hot shower. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement. It wasn't her reflection, it was something behind it. Two small figures, pale and still, stood just beyond the glass. Mia spun around, her heart pounding. The bathroom was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, they were gone. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. Just tired, she muttered to herself. But that night, she dreamed of children, two of them, a boy and a girl, their faces white as porcelain, their eyes impossibly black. They stood at the edge of her bed, watching her. Mia was 13, and her family had just moved into the old house at the edge of town. Her parents called it a fixer-upper, but Mia thought it was just plain creepy. The creaky floors, the dimly lit hallways, and especially the old mirrors built into the walls of almost every room gave her chills. The mirrors were antiques, her mother had said. The previous owners had insisted they stay with the house. They give it character, her mom had gushed. Mia wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the way they caught the light, like they were watching her. By the end of the week, Mia started noticing things. Her reflection didn't always move the way it should. Sometimes, it lagged, just for a second, before catching up. Other times, it seemed to smile when she wasn't smiling. And always, in the background, there were the children. They didn't appear all at once, a flicker here, a shadow there. But soon, they were always there, standing just beyond the glass, their faces blank and unblinking. Mia tried to tell her parents, but they brushed it off. It's just your imagination, her dad said, ruffling her hair. This old house takes some getting used to, but Mia knew it wasn't her imagination. The children weren't just in the mirrors anymore. She heard them at night, faint giggles and a soft patter of feet, even though she was supposed to be alone. Once, she woke up to find her closet door ajar, and when she closed it, the mirror on the inside showed them standing behind her. "Who are you?" she whispered one night, staring into the mirror in her room. The children tilted their heads, their black eyes shining. "Come play," the boy said. "No," Mia said, her voice trembling. "Leave me alone." The girl giggled, her voice high and eerie. "You're already with us," she said. The next morning, Mia woke to find the mirrors covered. Her mom had decided the old glass was too creepy and draped sheets over every one of them. For the first time in days, Mia felt like she could breathe. But that relief didn't last. That night, the giggles were louder. The sheets covering the mirrors fluttered as if caught in a breeze. Even though the windows were shut, Mia pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound was inside her head. When she finally summoned the courage to pull the sheet off her bedroom mirror, her reflection wasn't there. Instead, the children stared back at her, their pale hands pressed against the glass. "You can't hide," the boy said. "We're waiting," the girl added, her lips curling into a smile. By the next week, Mia's parents noticed something was wrong. She stopped eating, barely slept, and avoided her own reflection at all costs. When her mother tried to reassure her, Mia snapped. "You don't understand," she screamed. "They're in the mirrors. They're watching me." Her parents exchanged worried glances, but they didn't believe her. They couldn't see the children, even when Mia pointed them out. Her father took her to a doctor. The doctor prescribed pills. The pills didn't help. The final night came in late October, when the wind howled outside and the house groaned with every gust. Mia sat in her room, staring at the covered mirror. She knew they were there, waiting. The voices were louder now, calling her name over and over. "Mia, Mia, come play." Her hands trembled as she pulled the sheet away. This time, there was no hesitation. The children smiled at her, their hands outstretched. "You belong with us now," the boy said. The glass rippled like water. Before Mia could scream, their hands reached out, grabbing her. They pulled her through, the surface cold and sharp as ice. Her cries faded as the mirror smoothed over, leaving no trace of her behind. When Mia's parents checked her room the next morning, she was gone. The window was locked from the inside, her bed untouched. They called the police, but no one could explain her disappearance. The mirror stayed in the house, untouched. And sometimes, late at night, her parents thought they heard faint giggles or soft flickers of movement in the glass. But when they looked closer, there was nothing there, just their own reflections. If you ever move into a house with old mirrors, be careful where you look. Sometimes, the things you see don't let you go. The scarecrow had always been there, perched in the middle of the old Coldwater farm, its straw-stuffed frame tilted slightly to one side, as though it had grown weary of standing guard. Its head was a burlap sack, stitched with crude black thread to form a permanent, lopsided grin. A wide-brimmed hat sat crooked on its head, casting shadows over button eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. No one in Black Hollow liked the scarecrow, but no one dared remove it, either. The farm had been abandoned for years, its fields overgrown with weeds, but the scarecrow remained. Some kids claimed it moved when you weren't looking. Others swore they heard it, whispering in the wind. And then there was the legend. They said the Coldwater family had made a pact with something inhuman. They'd placed the scarecrow in their fields as part of the deal, a talisman to protect their harvest. But when the family disappeared one stormy night, the scarecrow stayed behind, its grin fixed as if it knew the truth. This year, the town's teenagers decided to test the legend. Halloween night was their chance to prove they weren't afraid of an old strawman. A group of 6 dared each other to sneak onto the Coldwater farm and touch the scarecrow. Danny, the ringleader, led the way with a flashlight in hand, its beam slicing through the thick October fog. Behind him, Sarah, Mark, Emily, Kyle, and Jenna followed, their laughter shaky but defiant. They reached the edge of the field, where the scarecrow loomed in the distance, silhouetted against the full moon. "Looks harmless to me," Danny said, though his voice wavered. He handed the flashlight to Mark and stepped forward. "Watch this." As Danny approached, the air grew colder. The wind picked up, rustling the dry corn stalks around them. The scarecrow stood motionless, its grin seeming wider in the pale light. "Come on, Danny," Jenna called nervously. "Just touch it, and let's go." Danny reached out, his hand trembling. His fingers brushed the burlap, and for a moment, nothing happened. He laughed, turning back to his friends. "See, it's just a stupid." The Scarecrow's head snapped toward him. Danny froze, his laughter choking in his throat. The others screamed as the Scarecrow's button eyes gleamed in the dark. Its stitched mouth opened wide, and a low, guttural sound emerged, like the groan of wind through a hollow tree. "Run," Sarah shouted, grabbing Emily's arm. They bolted toward the edge of the field, the cornstalk swaying violently around them. Danny didn't move. His eyes were locked on the Scarecrow as its straw arms reached for him. Impossibly long and thin. The last thing he heard was the sound of the other's footsteps fading as the Scarecrow's grin enveloped him. By the time the remaining 5 reached the road, Danny was gone. They huddled together, breathless and terrified, arguing about what to do. "We have to go back," Kyle said, his voice shaking. "We can't leave him." "No way," Sarah snapped. "Did you see that thing? It's not human." The Scarecrow appeared at the edge of the field. It moved awkwardly, its limbs jerking like a puppet on strings. The button eyes glowed faintly, fixed on the group. They screamed and ran, but no matter how fast they went, the Scarecrow seemed closer each time they looked back, one by one. It took them. Kyle was dragged into the cornstalks, his cries cut short. Jenna tripped and fell, her flashlight spinning away as the Scarecrow loomed over her. Sarah and Emily made it to the barn, slamming the door shut behind them, but the whispers started almost immediately, soft and mocking. "It's in here," Emily whimpered, clutching Sarah's arm. The barn was dark, the air thick with the smell of hay and decay. The whispers grew louder. The Scarecrow stepped out of the shadows, its grin impossibly wide. By dawn, the Coldwater farm was silent. The Scarecrow stood in its usual place, its head tilted slightly to the side. But if you looked closely, you could see something new. Scraps of fabric caught in the straw, and 5 new buttons stitched along its chest. If you ever hear whispers near an old Scarecrow, turn around and walk the other way. Some things aren't just watching, they're waiting. No one ever went down Nowhere Road by choice. The narrow dirt path wound through miles of dense forest, its ruts deep and unforgiving. Maps didn't show it, and GPS devices refused to acknowledge its existence. But those who lived near the town of Red Hollow knew exactly where it was. The stories were always the same. If you went far enough, you'd find the house. It didn't have a name, just a reputation, a 2-story Victorian relic, its roof sagging and its windows dark, perched at the very end of the road like it had been waiting for you all along. The locals said it appeared when it wanted to and disappeared just as easily. They also said that no one who entered ever came back. Leah and her friends didn't believe in ghost stories. College seniors with a taste for urban legends, they made a game out of hunting down haunted places and proving the rumors wrong. On a chilly Friday night, with a cooler of beer in the back seat and a playlist of Eerie tunes, they set off to find a house at the end of Nowhere Road. The drive was longer than expected. The deeper they went, the narrower the road became. The trees pressed in close, their bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Leah checked her phone. It was useless. No signal. The others joked nervously, but an uneasy silence fell over them as the car headlights finally caught the outline of the house. It was just as the stories described, decayed but oddly menacing, with shutters hanging at odd angles and a porch that sagged under its own weight. The wind howled through the trees, but the house stood perfectly still, as if the world around it didn't dare disturb it. "Looks like someone forgot to call a contractor," Jared said, trying to lighten the mood. Leah smirked, but her fingers tightened on the flashlight in her lap. "Let's get this over with," she said, climbing out of the car. The front door was unlocked. It creaked open, revealing a long hallway shrouded in shadows. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if no one had breathed here in decades. The group stuck close together, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the dark. They found the living room first. A broken piano sat in one corner, its keys stained yellow. Faded wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing dark, splintered wood beneath. The furniture was old but untouched, as if the house had been waiting for guests to arrive. Creepy, but not haunted, Jared said, snapping a photo with his phone. The flash illuminated the room for a split second, and Leah swore she saw a shadow moving across the far wall. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" said Anna. One of the others. Leah didn't answer. She took a step forward, her flashlight trembling. The shadow was gone. The deeper they went into the house, the worse the air felt, thicker, colder, alive. The group's jokes faded into uneasy silence. Doors creaked open on their own. Footsteps echoed down empty halls. Leah tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just her imagination, but then they heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like nails on wood. "What the hell is that?" Jared asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's coming from upstairs," Leah said, her stomach nodding. Against every instinct screaming at them to leave, they climbed the staircase. The tapping grew louder, leading them to a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out. Jared pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a single wooden chair in the center. On the chair sat a doll, its porcelain face cracked, its glass eyes staring directly at them. The tapping stopped. "Okay, this is officially messed up," Anna said, backing toward the door. But before they could leave, the house groaned, the walls seeming to shift around them. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The lights from their flashlights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. Shadows spilled across the walls, twisting into shapes that weren't human. A voice echoed through the room, low and guttural, speaking words they couldn't understand. The doll's head turned, its cracked lips parting. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a hollow rasp. Panic erupted. Jared pounded on the door, screaming, while Leah's flashlight spun wildly, illuminating the walls. Faces emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, pale and hollow-eyed, mouths open in silent screams. The last thing Leah saw before the lights went out was the doll, its glass eyes glinting with something alive. The next morning, the house was gone. The police found Leah's car abandoned on the side of the road, its doors wide open. The townsfolk shook their heads, adding her name to the long list of those who'd vanished near Nowhere Road. If you ever find yourself on a path that doesn't seem to end, turn around. Some roads don't lead you home, they lead you to the house, and the house always wins.